My name is Giorgia Meloni, and I'm a financial analyst, but to my stepfather, I've always just been the girl who thinks too much. He never said it outright, at least not in those exact words. Instead, he dressed it up in patronizing smiles, backhanded compliments, and offhand remarks like, "Georgia, you've always been so organized. It'll make you a great mom one day." Or, "Leave the numbers to the men, sweetheart. You should do something creative." And the one I'll never forget, "Women just aren't cut out for finance." That one still echoes in my mind, even after everything I've done to prove him wrong. But before we get to the revenge, the power moves, and how I turned the entire game upside down, let me take you back to where it all began, to the moment I realized just how little Richard, my stepfather, thought of me, and how I turned that disrespect into my greatest motivator. My mother married Richard when I was 10 years old. At first, he seemed like a nice guy. Flashy smile, expensive watch, that salesman energy that makes people lean in even when they should run. He owned a few small businesses back then, a car dealership, a real estate firm, a handful of rental properties. He was loud, confident, always on. And he liked to talk about money, all the time. He'd brag about how he turned $100 into a fortune, or how he saw through the stock market like Neo in the Matrix. He had opinions on everything, from cryptocurrency to land development to gold bars hidden in bunkers. I was fascinated at first, but then I started noticing the holes in his stories, inconsistencies, things that didn't quite add up. But my mom, she was charmed. He gave her the sense of security she lost after my dad died, and I think, in her mind, Richard was the solution to her fear of being alone. She wanted love and stability, and he played the part, until the ink dried on the marriage certificate. As I got older, I grew more curious about money. While other girls my age were reading fashion magazines or obsessing over movie stars, I was flipping through Forbes and reading articles about women like Abigail Johnson and Melody Hobson. I opened my first Roth IRA at 19. I tracked my net worth in spreadsheets that I color-coded and updated weekly. When I got a scholarship to study finance, I cried. "Richard," he laughed. "Finance? That's a tough world. You sure you're ready for that kind of pressure?" I told him yes. He shrugged. "All right, but don't expect any handouts from me when it chews you up." I didn't ask for his help. I graduated summa cum laude, landed a job at a boutique firm right out of school, earned my CFA designation while working 60-hour weeks and battling imposter syndrome in conference rooms full of men who barely glanced my way. And yet I thrived. I didn't just understand the numbers, I saw patterns, market rhythms, behavioral finance, risk mitigation strategies. I loved it. It was a language I could speak fluently, even when people doubted I had the right accent. But no matter how far I rose, Richard treated my career like a hobby. Then came the family trust. My grandmother, my mom's mom, passed away a few years ago and left behind a sizable estate, rental income, a blue-chip stock portfolio, and a family cabin in Vermont that had been in our name for generations. Everything went into a family trust. My mom was the primary trustee until her health started declining. That's when the chaos started. Richard saw an opportunity. He stepped in as acting trustee, citing Mom's illness and undue stress, claimed he'd take over the hard stuff so she could rest. She agreed reluctantly, and the paperwork went through. That trust became his playground. He began reallocating assets, vignettes, as he called it, moving money from stable dividend-paying stocks to speculative real estate ventures. He sold the cabin without asking me or anyone and invested the money into a strip mall renovation project in Arizona. He even moved a portion of the trust into a crypto hedge fund run by one of his poker buddies. I lost it. I came to him with a binder full of printouts, charts, and performance metrics showing how reckless he was being. I spoke calmly, logically, the way I'd been trained. He sat back in his leather office chair, laced his fingers behind his head, and said, "You're cute when you try to act like a big girl." I froze. He kept going. "I get that you read a few books and passed a few tests, Georgia, but this is real money, not Monopoly. You've never managed 7 figures before. You don't know what it takes." "I know you're violating your fiduciary duty," I snapped. He smirked. "Prove it." I went to my mom. She looked tired, worn down. I showed her everything. Balance sheets, risk assessments, side-by-side comparisons of Richard's portfolio performance versus the old allocation. She looked at me and said, "He's doing his best." "He's gambling with Grandma's legacy," I pleaded. "I don't want to fight." I knew then that I'd have to fight without her. And that's exactly what I did. I started gathering evidence. Emails, transaction records, screenshots of his text messages bragging about a new watch he bought with trust dividends. I quietly reached out to my cousin Lily, who was also a beneficiary of the trust, and showed her everything. Her response? Let's burn him down. Together, we hired a lawyer, a good one, and we began the process of removing Richard as trustee for breach of fiduciary duty. It wasn't easy. He fought back hard, tried to paint me as unstable, said I was just a bitter little girl who didn't get her way. But the numbers didn't lie, and neither did my credentials. I testified in court, calm, clear, concise. I showed how he'd liquidated stable investments for risky ventures that underperformed the S&P 500 by 27%, how he moved trust money into projects that had direct ties to his friends, how he had spent over $40,000 in miscellaneous expenses with no documentation. The judge listened and then ruled in our favor. Richard was removed as trustee. I was instated as interim trustee. Lily cried in the hallway, "You saved us!" But I wasn't done yet. Now, it was time to clean up the mess. Taking over the family trust was like walking into a house mid-collapse. The foundation wasn't just cracked, it had termites. Within the first week of my appointment as interim trustee, I uncovered over a dozen bad investments. One commercial property in Nevada was still under construction, but had already burned through 85% of its projected budget. A green tech startup Richard had backed turned out to be little more than a flashy website and a pitch deck. Worse, the rental properties Grandma had relied on for steady income had been sold off, quietly, and well below market value. And then there was the miscellaneous expenses line, nearly $50,000 used to fund what looked like luxury weekends, poker buy-ins, and business meals that coincided with football games and yacht rentals. The further I dug, the more I realized something chilling. This wasn't mismanagement. It was sabotage dressed up as confidence. Richard hadn't just made bad calls, he'd enriched himself at the trust's expense, assuming no one would notice, or worse, assuming no one capable of noticing would ever be allowed in. He didn't count on me. I got to work. I sold off the underperforming assets and moved the remaining funds into diversified ETFs and long-term dividend growth stocks. I reached out to the property management company Grandma used to work with and renegotiated a deal to purchase 2 stable rental units from a retiring landlord. I reviewed every transaction, every invoice, every document Richard had touched. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just managing other people's portfolios. I was defending my family's legacy, and I was damn good at it. Of course, Richard didn't go quietly. The moment he got wind that I was taking action, the calls started. Voicemail after voicemail, full of indignation. "You're tanking my investments. You're ruining everything I built. This trust was doing just fine before you came along." I saved every single message, just in case. Then came the emails. Not just from Richard, but from some of his friends. Men I'd seen at family parties, the ones who used to pat me on the head like I was a puppy when I brought deviled eggs. They wrote things like, "Maybe finance isn't your lane. Just because you passed a few tests doesn't mean you're ready for the big leagues." Should have let Richard finish what he started. It was enraging and familiar, because I'd heard versions of those comments my whole career, sometimes subtle, sometimes sharp. They always came from the same type of man, the one who'd rather lose $1 million than admit a woman could manage it better. I didn't respond. I built. Within 6 months, the trust was stabilized. Income streams were back online, cash flow was up, the portfolio had grown 9.3%, even in a volatile market. And Lily? She texted me one day with a screenshot of her new apartment lease. "Couldn't have done this without you. Grandma would be proud." I cried. Not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me why I did this in the first place. For the women in my family who were told to stay quiet. For the ones who never got the chance to prove they were more than helpers. And for myself. Because for the first time, I wasn't seeking approval. I was setting the standard. Then something happened that I didn't see coming. I started getting calls. Not from lawyers or family, but from old clients. From colleagues who'd gone to other firms. From women who heard about what I did through a mutual friend or cousin or colleague. They all wanted the same thing. "Can you help me understand my money? I think my husband is mismanaging our finances, but I'm too scared to ask. My dad passed away and left everything to my brother. I just want to know where I stand." And then came the big one. A call from an editor at a major business magazine. "We heard what you did with your family trust," she said. "We'd love to feature you in our Women in Wealth series." At first, I hesitated. I'd spent so long doing this work behind the scenes, in spreadsheets and silence. But then I thought of that day in Richard's office, the way he'd smirked at me like I was a child pretending to play grown-up. And I said I'd be honored. The article went live 2 weeks later. From dismissed to dominant, how Giorgia Meloni turned family betrayal into a financial comeback. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of women reached out. Some shared horror stories about being left out of inheritances. Others asked how to start investing. A few just wrote to say, "Thank you for showing it can be done." And for the first time, I saw a new future forming in front of me. One where I wasn't just managing portfolios. I was mentoring women to manage their own. I started a side project, an online course for women learning to take control of their finances. Nothing flashy, just the basics: budgeting, investing, estate planning. But I taught it in a way that felt safe, empowering, practical. Within a month, it had over 2,000 signups. I launched a podcast next, then a newsletter, then a small advisory firm focused solely on helping women build, protect, and pass down wealth, with no condescension, no jargon, and no men named Richard telling them they weren't cut out for it. We called it Rooted Finance, because women don't need to start from scratch. They just need to remember their strength and plant it where it can grow. A year after I took over the family trust, things were peaceful. My days were full, reviewing client portfolios, mentoring women, hosting virtual finance workshops, and taking long walks in the mornings before diving into the numbers. The trust continued to perform beautifully. We passed the 15% growth mark by the end of the fiscal year. I set up a scholarship fund in Grandma's name and allocated monthly distributions to my mom's medical care. Lily got engaged. She asked me to be her maid of honor. Everything that had once felt shaky was now steady, grounded. And then Richard resurfaced. It was an email. Subject line, "Let's talk." The body? Just one line, "You owe me a conversation." I stared at the screen for a long time. I hadn't heard from him in months. He'd vanished after losing the court case, leaving behind a mess of unpaid bills, angry investors, and burned bridges. I deleted it. But 3 days later, he showed up. Not at my office, not at my home, at my mom's care facility. That's what finally lit my fire again. I was in her room helping her with dinner when a nurse came in. "There's a man in the lobby asking for you," she said, uneasy. "He says his name is Richard." I felt my jaw tighten. I kissed my mom on the forehead and told her I'd be back. He was sitting in one of the floral lobby chairs, wearing a wrinkled blazer and shoes that hadn't been polished in months. He stood when he saw me. "You look good," he said. "You look desperate," I replied. He laughed under his breath, like he thought we were still playing a game. "You've made quite a name for yourself." "I didn't do it for fame." "No, but it sure looks good on you." I crossed my arms. "What do you want?" He sighed and dropped back into the chair. "I lost everything." "Good. I just need a little help." I blinked. "You're asking me for money?" He shrugged. "You said the trust is doing great. You've got clients, a podcast. I need something to get back on my feet." The audacity of this man. "You stole from us. You lied to us. You mocked me. And now you want me to help you?" He held out his hands. "Giorgia, I messed up, but we're family." "No," I said, "we're a cautionary tale." I turned to walk away. He stood again. "You really think you're better than me now?" I didn't even pause. I always was. I never heard from him again after that. Not directly, at least. A few months later, I got a letter from an attorney saying Richard had filed for bankruptcy and was trying to liquidate what little remained of his business assets. There was a clause in the paperwork requesting a character statement from a family member. I tossed it in the shredder. He'd already written his story. He didn't need mine. And then one day I found something. It was a dusty old journal of Grandma's, tucked away in a box of estate files I hadn't gotten around to sorting. Inside were little notes she'd written over the years. Recipes, grocery lists, old investment ideas. But near the back was a passage that stopped me cold. She'd written, "One day I hope Giorgia gets what's hers. She's got the mind, the heart, and the backbone. She's the one I trust." I closed the journal and held it to my chest. There it was, the validation I didn't even know I still needed. Not from Richard, not from anyone else, but from the woman who built the legacy I was now protecting. These days, when I speak at events or do interviews, people ask me what advice I'd give young women entering the world of finance. I tell them this: don't wait for permission. Don't let titles or tradition define your worth. And never let a man tell you what you're not cut out for, especially if he's too scared to compete with you. Build your own table. Pull up your own chair. And if someone tries to laugh at you like you're not a threat, smile, because you are. And they know it. I still visit the cemetery sometimes. I bring fresh lavender and a copy of my latest financial report because Grandma would have loved the graphs. I sit on the bench near her stone and update her on everything. The women I've helped, the courses I've launched, the trust now thriving and growing. The silence feels full, not empty, like she's listening, like she always was. I'll never forget what Richard said that day in his office. "You're cute when you try to act like a big girl. But now, I own the room, the desk, the title, the trust. And I don't act like anything anymore. I just am, because I'm Giorgia Meloni. And I was always cut out for finance. They just weren't ready for me."